The wind howled like something alive, tearing through the pine branches with a violence that made James grip the rope tighter. 48 hours ago, he'd set out from base camp with his German Shepherd Max, expecting a routine 3-day expedition through the Colorado wilderness. The avalanche warning system had malfunctioned. The satellite phone had died. Now, clinging to the hollow interior of a massive spruce tree at 11,000 feet, James watched the thermometer on his wrist drop past -40 degrees Celsius. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Max, who pressed against his chest, their shared body heat the only barrier between them and hypothermia. The dog's breath came in small clouds, crystallizing in the brutal cold. James had been a mountain guide for 23 years. He'd survived storms, avalanches, and altitude sickness. But nothing had prepared him for this, the way the cold seemed to penetrate not just his body, but his mind, making thought itself feel sluggish. His emergency shelter, a bivy-sack designed for extreme conditions, was barely holding. The tree's hollow had been luck, pure luck. A lightning strike years ago had created a cavity just large enough for a man and a dog to curl into. The radio crackled with static. The rescue team had called 3 times. Each time, James confirmed his position and that he was stable. Each time he heard the same response. Weather conditions made any helicopter approach impossible. They were sending a ground team, but the pass was blocked. 48 hours minimum, they said. James looked down at Max, whose dark eyes watched him with a calmness that seemed almost human. The dog had never panicked, not once during the slide, not during the desperate scramble to higher ground, not during the endless hours in this tree. Max simply existed, accepting the cold and the darkness as facts to endure. "We'll make it," James said, though the words felt fragile in the freezing air. "We'll make it because we have to." Outside the tree, the world had transformed into something alien. Snow fell sideways, driven by winds that gusted beyond 80 kilometers per hour. The forest below disappeared into white. The sky was indistinguishable from the earth. Time felt meaningless in this void of gray and white and endless cold. James checked his supplies. 1/2 liter of water, 3 energy bars, a first aid kit, and the emergency beacon. He had fuel for the small camping stove, enough for perhaps 8 more hours of warmth if he rationed it carefully. After that, he and Max would depend entirely on their body heat and the tree's fragile shelter. He thought about his daughter Sarah, away at university in Boulder. He thought about the coffee he'd have when he got down. Hot, black, real coffee, not the instant powder in his pack. He thought about the simple luxury of a warm bed, dry clothes, and the sound of rain instead of wind. But mostly, he focused on the moment, on Max's steady breathing, on the small flame of the camping stove, on staying conscious, staying alert, staying alive. The cold was a living thing now, patient and relentless. It probed every seam of his jacket, every gap in his gloves. It whispered that surrender would be easier than fighting. James recognized the signs of hypothermia creeping into his thinking. The seductive pull towards sleep, the irrational thoughts, the slow descent into confusion. He forced himself to move, to flex his fingers and toes every few minutes, to eat even though he had no appetite, to drink water even though swallowing hurt. He talked to Max constantly, his own voice the only proof that he was still present, still fighting. "Tell me about the time you caught that rabbit," he said to the dog. "Remember, took you 3 hours. You were so proud." Max's tail thumped weakly against his leg. "We're going to have lots of adventures after this. I'm going to buy you the best treats, and we're going to hike every trail in Colorado, every single one." Outside, the blizzard intensified. The tree swayed slightly, a movement that would have terrified James a year ago but now barely registered. The wood was solid, rooted deep. It had survived centuries of storms. It would survive this one. James closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. Hypothermia victims had died from falling asleep. Instead, he existed in a state between waking and dreaming, holding Max close, feeding the stove, counting the minutes until dawn. The wind screamed, the temperature fell, and in the hollow of an ancient tree, a man and his dog endured. The cold had a texture now. James could feel it as something almost solid, pressing in from all sides. His thermometer read -45 degrees Celsius. The forecast he'd caught on the radio before the battery died had predicted it would drop further, potentially to -50 by morning. He'd stopped feeling his toes 6 hours ago. That was the first real sign of danger. Frostbite moved quickly in these conditions. James had treated frostbite before, had guided people down from similar situations, had always assumed he understood the risk. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it were entirely different things. He massaged his feet methodically, working circulation back into them, though the pain was extraordinary. His hands were worse. They'd gotten wet when he'd worked to improve the shelter, using strips of bark to better seal the gaps. Wet skin in -45-degree cold was a recipe for serious injury. Max had begun to shiver, which meant the dog was approaching the edge of his own cold tolerance. James rearranged their position, creating a pocket of warmth using the emergency blanket from his pack. He'd been rationing his fuel carefully, using the stove for only 15 minutes every 2 hours, just enough to warm the immediate area and melt snow for water. The rescue team had called again. Their update was the same, weather-bound, but ground team was making progress. "We're coming for you," the voice on the radio said. It sounded infinitely far away. James thought about calling back, about saying something profound or emotional, but he didn't. He'd learned long ago that in emergencies, sentiment was a luxury. You survived by focusing on practical details: heat, hydration, preventing injury, staying conscious. He ate an energy bar slowly, forcing himself to chew thoroughly. Nutrition mattered. His body was burning enormous amounts of calories just to maintain its core temperature. The 3 remaining bars might cover 12 hours if he was lucky. The worst part wasn't the cold anymore. It was the sensory deprivation. Trapped in the tree's hollow, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction, with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional creak of wood, James felt his mind beginning to spiral. He forced himself to recite memories, the names of every client he'd ever guided, the layout of his house, the route of his morning run, the periodic table from his high school chemistry class. Max shifted against him, and James felt a moment of sharp fear. Was the dog okay? He ran his hands carefully over Max's body, checking for signs of distress, but the German shepherd's breathing was steady, just restless, the way dogs got in enclosed spaces. "It's all right," James murmured. "We're going to get through this. You're the strongest dog I know. You know that? Toughest creature I've ever met." He thought about when he'd gotten Max 8 years ago as a 4-month-old puppy with enormous paws and a personality to match. Max had been untrained and wild, destroying everything in sight for the first year. But something about the dog had clicked with James, a mutual recognition perhaps that they were both meant for mountains and wilderness. They'd hiked thousands of kilometers together. Max had alerted James to an injured hiker once, had helped locate a lost child, had simply been present through all the quiet moments and the loud ones. If James didn't make it down, someone would find the body. But Max might not be found for days. The thought was almost unbearable. He forced himself away from that line of thinking. Catastrophizing was a symptom of hypothermia, a sign that his core temperature was dropping dangerously. He needed to be strategic, tactical, focused on survival metrics. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep or rest, James did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not to anything specific, not to any deity he'd ever formally believed in, but to the universe itself, to chance and probability, to whatever force kept people alive against odds. "Let us make it," he said aloud. "Let me get this dog down the mountain. Let me see my daughter's graduation. That's all I'm asking. Just that." The wind didn't answer. The cold didn't relent. But James felt something shift inside him, a settling into acceptance. Not surrender, never that, but an acceptance of what was happening, a clear-eyed assessment of the situation. They would survive because they had to, and if they didn't, at least they wouldn't face it alone. 36 hours into the ordeal, James's mind began to fragment. It started small, forgetting what day it was, losing track of how many times he'd used the stove, confusing memories with present moment. Then it accelerated. At one point he tried to stand up and couldn't remember why. His legs simply wouldn't obey the signal from his brain. He was in the early stages of severe hypothermia, and he knew it. The thermometer read -52 degrees Celsius. The fuel was nearly gone. His feet had stopped hurting, which was actually worse. It meant the frostbite was progressing deeper into the tissue. Max pressed against him more closely now, as if the dog sensed James's declining state. The German Shepherd had barely eaten, rationing his body's energy just like James was doing. The radio had gone silent. James didn't know if that was a technical problem or if the rescue team had decided to call off their approach for the night. The thought that no one was coming, that he and Max would simply freeze in this tree, occurred to him. Then it passed. Then it came back. Hypothermia was a strange kind of death. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt like sinking into the most comfortable sleep, like finally being allowed to rest. People died from it thinking they were warm, thinking they were fine. The cold had a way of lying to your nervous system. James forced himself to take an inventory of his physical state, using medical knowledge to counteract the hypothermia's insidious logic. Core body temperature, estimated 33 degrees Celsius. Normal is 37. Mental status, confused, intermittent shivering. A good sign: when shivering stops, it's very bad. Extremities, severe frostbite risk in fingers and toes. Hydration, inadequate fuel, critical low. He needed to act now, in this moment of relative lucidity, before his mind deteriorated further. He drank water, forced himself to eat the last energy bar, and used the stove for a full 30 minutes, longer than he'd rationed before. The fuel might not last, but if he died of hypothermia tonight, it wouldn't matter anyway. The warmth was extraordinary. James sat as close to the small flame as he could without burning himself, feeling something almost like hope return to his consciousness. He thought about giving up. It would be so easy. Let the cold take him. Let the pain stop. Instead, he talked to Max. He told the dog about his childhood in Utah, about learning to climb as a boy, about the first time he'd reached a summit. He talked about Sarah, about his ex-wife who he'd divorced but never stopped caring about all the small moments that constituted a life. "You're a good dog," he said to Max, running his hand over the German Shepherd's head. "You know that? You're the best friend I've ever had, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I took us up this mountain. I'm sorry I didn't check the equipment more carefully." Max's tail moved weakly. Then something changed. The wind, which had been a constant roar for more than a day, suddenly shifted. James heard it drop in pitch and intensity. The blizzard was breaking. He pressed his ear against the tree trunk, listening. Yes, the wind was definitely diminishing. The snow was still falling, but the driving force behind it seemed to be easing. "Did you hear that?" he asked Max. "Did you hear that? The storm's breaking?" As if in response to his words, James heard something else. A sound carried on the wind, distant but unmistakable. The sound of an engine, a snowmobile, maybe two. James reached for the emergency beacon, his fingers barely responding to his commands, and activated it again. The radio crackled to life. "Base camp, this is Stranded Party. Do you copy?" His voice sounded strange, thin and high-pitched. The response came through clear. "We see you on the beacon. We're coming. Hold tight. Hold tight." The rescue team reached James and Max just before sunset on the third day. 2 paramedics and 3 volunteer rescue personnel came up through the breaking storm, moving with practiced efficiency. The first paramedic, a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, took one look at James and began preparing oxygen and heating protocols. "Severe hypothermia," she said into her radio. "Possible stage 3. Getting him warmed up now. Move carefully. Rapid rewarming can cause problems." James was barely conscious as they bundled him onto a stretcher. He'd survived, but he was far from safe. Hypothermia victims could suffer cardiac events during the rewarming process. His frostbite was severe. His body had endured 3 days of conditions that most humans couldn't survive. But Max had to come down too. James kept trying to say this, though the words came out garbled and barely intelligible. "Your dog's fine," one of the rescue personnel assured him. "We've got him." The journey down the mountain was a blur of motion, of careful maneuvering, of medical interventions. They'd brought a special warming tent that they set up at a lower altitude, where the temperature was marginally less extreme. Inside the tent, surrounded by heating pads and warm IV fluids, James's body temperature began its slow climb back to normal. He drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, he saw Max being examined by Dr. Chen, the dog submitting to the checks with the same patient acceptance he'd shown during the ordeal. The helicopter arrived the next morning. As James was loaded aboard, he reached out for Max, and the rescue team made sure the dog was loaded at the same time. They wouldn't separate them, the lead paramedic said. They'd been through too much together. The hospital in Denver admitted James with severe hypothermia, frostbite of both feet and frostbite of both hands. He spent 2 weeks in intensive care while doctors worked to gradually rewarm his body, treat the frostbite, and monitor for complications. The frostbite on his toes required surgery. 3 of his right toes and 1 of his left would eventually be amputated as the tissue died and couldn't be saved. His fingers were luckier. The tissue damage was severe, but amputation wasn't necessary. He would lose feeling in several fingers, but he would keep them. On the 10th day of his hospital stay, as he was beginning to regain some clarity, a nurse brought Max to visit. The dog had spent the intervening days at the county animal shelter, cared for by volunteers. Max walked carefully into the room, approached James's bed, and placed his head gently on the edge of the mattress. James, with bandaged hands that barely functioned, managed to stroke the dog's ears. Both of them had survived. Both would carry marks from the experience, but both had survived. It was then that a volunteer from the hospital approached James with a slightly puzzled expression. "Mr. Porter," the woman said, "I'm Helen Richardson, and I was part of the ground rescue team that found you. I wanted to visit and see how you were doing, but also I found something I wanted to ask you about." She held up a small cloth bag. "When we found you in the tree," Helen continued, "your dog had something in his mouth. It appeared he'd been holding it the entire time you were sheltered there. We carefully retrieved it. I've been trying to figure out what it was and how it got there." She opened the bag carefully and withdrew the object. It was a photograph, still surprisingly intact, despite 3 days in extreme cold. The plastic covering had protected it somewhat. The image showed a cabin, not a large structure but solidly built, with smoke coming from the chimney. A man stood in front of it, and from the style of the photograph and the clothing, it appeared to be from the 1960s or 1970s. "We found similar photos scattered around the area where you were sheltered," Helen explained. "It appears there was an old cabin near your tree, probably abandoned decades ago. Your dog must have found this and brought it to you, perhaps looking for shelter or a way to help. It's remarkable, really, as if he knew these photos might matter to you." James stared at the photograph. The old cabin. He'd read about it. There were legends among climbers about an old homestead somewhere in that range, built by someone who'd lived alone for years before abandoning it. James had always thought it was just a story. "The cabin's still standing," Helen said. "We saw it on our ascent. It's empty, but structurally sound. If you'd managed to reach it, well, you both would have been much more comfortable than in that tree." James looked at Max. who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog had been searching for shelter, for safety, and somewhere in Max's dog logic, he'd found evidence that shelter existed nearby. The photograph was a message, carried through impossible cold and isolation. "He saved us," James whispered. "He was trying to show me we could find better shelter," Helen smiled. "Maybe so, but I think you both saved each other." Recovery progressed slowly. By the end of his first month of rehabilitation, James could walk short distances with a cane, though the loss of 3 toes had altered his balance permanently. The nerve damage in his hands meant he had to relearn how to hold things, how to write, how to perform the fine motor tasks he'd taken for granted his entire life. Physical therapy was grueling. Some days, James wanted to quit, to accept the disability, to let his mountain guide days be behind him. But Max was there for most of the sessions, lying quietly in the corner of the therapy room, a constant presence that reminded James why he had to keep fighting. His daughter Sarah came home from university for a week. She found her father in the hospital's physical therapy room, struggling to rebuild the strength in his legs. "Dad," she said, approaching carefully, "they told me you almost didn't make it." James looked at his daughter, tall now, fully grown into adulthood, and felt the weight of what he'd put her through by taking that risk, by going up the mountain without triple recovery, progressed slowly. By the end of his first month of rehabilitation, James could walk short distances with a cane, though the loss of 3 toes had altered his balance permanently. The nerve damage in his hands meant he had to relearn how to hold things, how to write, how to perform the fine motor tasks he'd taken for granted his entire life. Physical therapy was grueling. Some days James wanted to quit, to accept the disability, to let his mountain guide days be behind him. But Max was there for most of the sessions, lying quietly in the corner of the therapy room, a constant presence that reminded James why he had to keep fighting. His daughter Sarah came home from university for a week. She found her father in the hospital's physical therapy room, struggling to rebuild the strength in his legs. "Dad," she said, approaching carefully, "they told me you almost didn't make it." James looked at his daughter, tall now, fully grown into adulthood, and felt the weight of what he'd put her through by taking that risk, by going up the mountain without triple-checking his equipment. "I didn't," he said quietly. "Almost didn't make it. Max made the difference, and luck, a lot of luck." Sarah sat down beside him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she asked the question James had been dreading. "Are you going back? After you recover?" It was the question that haunted him during the long nights in the hospital, during the painful physical therapy sessions, during every moment he looked at his bandaged hands or felt the phantom pain in his missing toes. "I don't know," James admitted. "I used to think I knew who I was, the mountain man, the guy who could handle anything nature threw at him. But 3 days in that tree, it changed something. I'm not sure I'm that person anymore." "Maybe that's okay," Sarah said. She reached out and carefully took one of his bandaged hands. "Maybe you get to be someone different now." Over the following weeks, as James transitioned from the hospital to an outpatient rehabilitation facility, he began to process what had happened. The media had picked up the story. Mountain guide survives extreme cold with loyal dog, and journalists wanted interviews. There were offers from production companies interested in making a documentary. The photograph that Max had found became part of the narrative, a symbol of the dog's intelligence and devotion. James turned most of it down. He wasn't interested in being a celebrity survival story. What he wanted was to understand what had happened, to make sense of the experience, and to figure out who he was supposed to be now. He attended a support group for frostbite survivors, held once a week in a community center in Boulder. There he met Tom, a man in his 60s who'd lost 4 fingers and both his big toes to frostbite after getting stranded in a blizzard 15 years earlier. Tom was a carpenter, or had been, and had struggled with depression and identity loss for years after his accident. "You're going to go through stages," Tom told James over coffee after one of the group meetings. "Denial, anger, bargaining, all that stuff they talk about. But here's what I wish someone had told me. You don't have to become your injury. You get to decide who you are now. How did you get through it? James asked. I built things, Tom said. Different kinds of things than I used to build, but I built them. It gave me purpose. It gave me back some agency in my own life. James thought about that conversation for days. What could he build? What could he do that would give his life meaning without requiring him to be the person he'd been before? The answer came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while James was sitting in the backyard of his home, which he'd rented out to a colleague while he was recovering, Max brought him a stick. Not to play fetch. The dog simply dropped it at James's feet and looked at him meaningfully. James picked up the stick. His right hand was still bandaged, but his left was improving. He turned the stick over in his hands, feeling its weight and texture. An idea began to form. He could make things, not with his hands in the precise way he used to, but differently. He could teach. He'd taught hundreds of climbers, hundreds of hikers. He could teach wilderness survival. He could teach people how to prepare, how to respect the mountains, how to come back alive. Within 6 months, James had launched an online course called Mountain Survival Essentials. He taught it from his home, often with Max lying beside him on camera. The course covered everything from equipment preparation to recognizing early signs of hypothermia, from navigation techniques to emergency communication. But more than that, it taught respect. Respect for the mountains, for the limitations of human bodies, for the importance of preparation and humility. The course filled up within weeks. People watched it because James's story was remarkable, but they stayed because his teaching was genuine and deeply informed by lived experience. One of his students was a young woman named Marcus, who wanted to become a search and rescue specialist. Marcus attended every lesson, asked thoughtful questions, and spent hours studying the survival techniques James taught. "I want to do what you do," Marcus told him during an online office hour. "Well, not exactly what you do anymore, but I want to help people. I want to work search and rescue. Your story inspired me." James felt something shift inside him. He'd spent months grieving the person he'd been, but now he was beginning to see the person he could become. He wasn't the mountain guide who could conquer any peak. He was something else now. A teacher, a survivor, a person who could transform his pain into knowledge that might save someone else's life. The phantom pain in his missing toes faded over time. The scars on his hands became less noticeable, but the marks on his psyche remained, not as wounds, but as evidence of transformation. One evening, 6 months into his recovery, James sat on his porch with Max, watching the sun set over the foothills. The dog's head was resting on his lap, and James stroked the familiar fur with his left hand, the one that was nearly back to normal. "We did okay," James said to Max. "We really did okay." Max's tail thumped against the wooden porch, and James felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for recovery, for the chance to build a new version of his life from the rubble of the old one. He thought about the photograph that Max had found, that mysterious image of the old cabin that might have saved their lives if they'd managed to find it. Helen had given it to him after he'd been discharged from the hospital, and it now hung on his wall, a reminder of how close they'd come to a different outcome. But they hadn't faced that outcome. They'd survived, and in surviving, they'd discovered something James hadn't known he was capable of, the ability to transform disaster into purpose. 6 months after being released from the hospital, James received an unexpected visitor. A filmmaker named David Chen showed up at his house with a proposal. "I want to make a film about your experience," David explained, sitting in James's living room with coffee that Sarah had prepared before she left for her afternoon class. Not a sensationalized survival story, but something more thoughtful. Your recovery, your teaching, your relationship with Max, all of it, how you're rebuilding your life after trauma. James's first instinct was to decline. He'd become tired of the attention, tired of being the mountain guide who survived. But David was persistent. And more importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in the deeper story. "I'm not interested in exploiting your pain," David said. "I'm interested in documenting transformation, how people rebuild when the life they knew becomes impossible." Over the following months, David and his small crew filmed James's rehabilitation journey. They documented his physical therapy sessions, his online teaching, his slow process of learning to navigate his new reality. They filmed Max too. The dog had become something of a celebrity, appearing on local news programs and in social media posts about the rescue. But David also filmed James's struggles, the nights when the phantom pain was so intense that James couldn't sleep, the frustration when his hands wouldn't cooperate in ways he needed them to, the grief of realizing he would never climb at the level he once had, would never experience the mountains the way he'd loved them. "This is important," David insisted when James suggested they focus only on the positive aspects. "People need to see that recovery isn't linear. It's not about triumphantly overcoming and moving on. It's about learning to live with what happened and finding meaning in the new life you build." During filming, David tracked down Helen Richardson, the rescue volunteer who'd found the mysterious photograph. Helen agreed to be interviewed, and her perspective added a crucial element to the documentary. "When we found James and Max in that tree," Helen recounted to the camera, "they were in critical condition. But what struck me wasn't just their physical survival, it was the bond between them. The dog had stayed with James the entire time, and James had fought so hard to keep them both alive. That kind of connection, it's rare. It's the thing that actually saves lives." David also interviewed Tom, James's friend from the support group, who talked about his own experience with frostbite and recovery. "People think survival is about being tough," Tom said, "about willpower and determination. And those things matter, but what really matters is having reasons to survive. For James, it was his daughter, it was his dog, it was the love he had for life, even in the worst moments. That's what kept him going." The documentary, titled Mountain's Shadow, A Story of Survival and Transformation, premiered at the Denver Film Festival 9 months after James's rescue. The premiere was a packed event, with James, Max, Sarah, and dozens of the people who'd been part of his journey, all in attendance. Watching the film, James saw himself through David's lens, not as a hero or a victim, but as a person navigating the complicated terrain of recovery and transformation. He saw his own pain reflected on screen, but he also saw his strength, his determination, and his capacity for growth. After the premiere, the documentary was picked up by a major streaming service. It gained international attention, and James received messages from people around the world who'd watched it and found inspiration in his story. But more importantly, he heard from people who'd experienced their own traumas, car accidents, illnesses, injuries, who said that watching James's journey had helped them find hope in their own recoveries. One message came from a young woman named Ashley, who'd suffered a severe spinal injury in a fall and had been struggling with depression during her rehabilitation. She wrote, "Watching your documentary, I realized I wasn't grieving just my injury. I was grieving the person I thought I would be. Seeing you figure out who you could become instead, it changed how I approach my recovery. Thank you." Messages like Ashley's poured in. James found himself becoming an accidental advocate for trauma survivors, not because he'd sought it out, but because his story resonated with people who were struggling with their own transformations. The documentary also led to opportunities. A major outdoor gear company approached James about consulting on cold weather equipment design, specifically focusing on improving systems for extreme condition survival. James worked with their engineering team, applying his lived experience to practical improvements that could save lives. He was invited to speak at universities, at search and rescue conferences, at medical symposiums about treating hypothermia and frostbite. Each time he brought Max, and each time the dog seemed to understand that they were there to help people understand what it meant to survive, to recover, to rebuild. One particularly emotional speaking engagement came when James was invited to address a group of mountaineers and guides from around the world. He talked about humility, about respect for nature's power, about the importance of preparation, and of knowing your own limitations. "I thought I knew my limitations," James told the assembled group. "I'd been guiding for 23 years. I'd survived avalanches, storms, altitude sickness. I thought I knew how much I could handle. And that hubris almost killed me and my dog." He paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. "The mountains don't care about your experience. They don't care about your achievements or your reputation. They operate according to laws that have nothing to do with human will. The only thing that saved my life was preparation, luck, the love I had for my dog, and a willingness to accept help when I needed it. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember that." Erdictum. As the documentary's reach expanded, James found himself in an unexpected position. He was no longer the mountain guide who could summit any peak. He was the man who'd nearly died on a mountain and had chosen to dedicate his recovery to helping others understand survival and transformation. It wasn't the identity he'd imagined for himself, but it was meaningful, and it was real, and it allowed him to use his pain as a bridge to help others cross their own difficult terrains. 1 year after the documentary premiered, James stood at the edge of a different kind of mountain, not a peak to be summited, but a training facility in the Colorado Rockies that he'd helped design, a center specifically for teaching wilderness survival and helping people prepare for extreme condition experiences. The facility featured classrooms for theoretical instruction, equipment testing areas, and carefully controlled environments where students could practice survival skills under supervision. But what made it unique was James's involvement in every aspect of the curriculum. Every lesson was informed by real experience, by the particular combination of knowledge and hard-won wisdom that came from surviving what many people wouldn't. Max was the center's unofficial mascot. The German Shepherd had aged noticeably in the year since the rescue. He was 12 years old now, which was elderly for a large dog. But he still accompanied James to the facility most days, lying in his bed in James's office while students passed by, often stopping to pet the famous dog they'd heard about in James's teaching videos. Sarah, now graduated with a degree in environmental science, had taken a position as the center's education coordinator. She worked alongside her father, helping develop curricula and manage the growing number of students who wanted to study wilderness survival with the man who'd survived the unsurvivable. "We have 300 applications for the next session," Sarah told her father one afternoon, showing him the enrollment numbers on her laptop. 300. "We can only take 20 students at a time." James shook his head in wonder. "A year ago, I didn't know if I'd ever teach again. I didn't know if I wanted to. Now look at this." The center's curriculum was comprehensive and rigorous. Students learned about equipment, navigation, physiology, psychology, and the particular challenges of different environments. But more than that, they learned to think critically about risk, to understand their own limitations, and to develop the humility that James had learned through near-death experience. One of the first students to complete the full program was Marcus, the young woman who'd inspired James with her commitment to search and rescue. After finishing the course, Marcus had gotten hired by a search and rescue team operating in the high country. 6 months later, she was part of a team that rescued a family of 4 who'd gotten stranded in a snowstorm. She came back to the facility to visit James, and she brought a letter written by one of the people she'd helped rescue, a woman named Catherine, who wanted to thank James for training the people who'd saved her family's lives. "Your teaching saved my husband and my 2 children," Catherine wrote. "The rescue team that found us knew exactly what to do because of what they learned from you. They kept us calm, they kept us warm, and they got us down safely. I don't know how to thank you for that." James read the letter 3 times, each time feeling the same surge of emotion. This was why he'd survived. This was why the recovery had mattered, why the pain had been worth enduring. His experience had become a tool that saved other people's lives. But the center wasn't just about training future rescue workers. It served a broader population, people who wanted to understand wilderness survival for personal growth, executives who participated in team-building exercises, teenagers from underprivileged backgrounds who got scholarships to attend the programs. One such student was a 16-year-old named Diego, whose mother brought him to the facility because Diego had been struggling with depression and had lost all interest in activities outside. The center's staff had him start with basic wilderness orientation, learning to read maps, to build shelter, to understand weather patterns. Over the course of the program, something shifted in Diego. He began to engage with the material, to understand that he was capable of more than he'd believed. On the final day of the program, Diego stood in front of James with tears in his eyes. "I didn't think I could do this," Diego said. "I didn't think I was strong enough, but I did it. I actually survived out here for 4 days with minimal equipment. I'm stronger than I thought." James put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You are, and now you know it. That knowledge, that changes things. It changes how you see yourself, how you approach challenges in your life." It was the kind of interaction that made James understand why he'd survived. Not for glory or recognition, but for moments like this. Moments when someone discovered they were capable of more than they'd believed. The documentary continued to circulate internationally. Film festivals showed it, schools used it in their curricula, and it inspired others to create programs focused on wilderness education and trauma recovery. James received emails from documentarians in Canada, Australia, and Europe who were making their own films about survival and transformation. But the most gratifying recognition came from unexpected places. A woman who'd survived a car accident wrote to tell him that watching James learn to walk again had inspired her to keep going through her own physical rehabilitation. A man who'd lost his job wrote that James's story about rebuilding his identity had helped him see his own job loss, not as an ending, but as an opportunity for transformation. One evening, 18 months after the rescue, James sat in his backyard with Max, much as he had many times before. But this time, Sarah was there too, and she'd brought someone, a young man named Michael, who was considering joining the center's staff as an instructor. "My dad almost died on a mountain," Sarah was saying to Michael. "And instead of letting that destroy him, he figured out how to use it to help other people. That's what I want to be part of, that kind of transformation." James listened to his daughter talk about his journey, and he felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of someone who'd overcome and moved on, but the completion of someone who'd integrated their trauma into their identity, who'd found meaning in survival, and who'd chosen to dedicate themselves to helping others find their own strength. Max's head was resting on James's lap, and the dog was sleeping peacefully in the Colorado evening. The German Shepherd had gray around his muzzle now, and he moved more slowly than he once had. But he was alive, and he was here, and he was still James's faithful companion. Looking at his daughter and the young man who wanted to join their mission, James thought about the 3 days in the tree. He thought about the cold, the fear, the moment when giving up would have been easier than fighting. He thought about Max's presence, which had made the difference between survival and surrender. And he thought about the woman Catherine, who'd written to say that his teaching had saved her family. He thought about Diego, discovering his own strength. He thought about Ashley, finding hope in his recovery. He thought about all the people who'd written to say that his story had changed their lives. This was why he'd survived. Not to become famous, not to be celebrated as a hero, but to use his pain and his recovery to illuminate the path for others who were struggling through their own dark mountains. As the sun set over the foothills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, James felt a deep gratitude for the life he'd been given. Not the life he'd imagined. He would never summit mountains the way he once had, would never feel quite the same way about wilderness. But a life that was meaningful, purposeful, and deeply connected to others who were on their own journeys of survival and transformation. Max opened his eyes and looked at James, and the dog's tail thumped against his leg. It was a small gesture, but it contained everything. The bond between them, the shared experience of surviving the unsurvivable, and the quiet knowledge that they'd both become different, deeper versions of themselves through the trial they'd endured together. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" James whispered to Max. The dog's tail thumped again, and James smiled. Yes, they had. They had done very good indeed. Before we wrap up, if you're enjoying this story of survival and transformation, don't forget to hit that like button. Your support means everything to the channel. If you've made it this far in James and Max's journey, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've watched. What moment resonated with you most? And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next incredible stories we'll be bringing you. Thanks for being part of this community.